Ned Stark had always suspected that the tales of winter's darkest evils were more than mere stories told to frighten southern children. When he'd first heard distant rumors of the White Walker's return, the Lord of Winterfell felt a stirring in his heart, a call to duty that superseded political obligations and family entanglements. It was the same feeling he'd had when King Robert's rebellion first took shape, a sense that the realm itself had foundered in dangerous waters. Only, this time, he knew the threat wasn't simply a civil war, it was the very promise of death and darkness creeping slowly from the coldest edges of the world. And so he decided quietly at first, for how could a man simply announce such a thing, to travel north, beyond the wall, to see what horrors waited in the frozen wastelands. By his side, he would take a small contingent of loyal men of the north. And he would take Jon Snow. Jon Snow was younger than Ned might have liked for such a mission, but there was no denying the boys. He was still a boy, wasn't he? Courage and thirst for answers about what lay beyond the great ice barrier. Jon had always been fascinated by the histories of the Night's Watch, by the cold legends of the First Men, by all that lay in the uncharted realms of the far north. And besides, Ned knew that deep down, Jon yearned for a father's acceptance. Even if they rarely spoke of such sentimental things, Ned had seen the longing in the boy's eyes, sensed it in those silent moments by the hearth at Winterfell. And so, when preparations began in earnest, when ravens were sent to gather arms and cold weather provisions, Ned summoned Jon to his solar and told him plainly, "The realm is in danger beyond what we can imagine. I would not leave you behind to brood with ghosts in Winterfell. Will you ride with me beyond the wall? Will you stand with me against an enemy we can barely name?" Jon had knelt, not entirely sure if it was necessary, and muttered something half-coherent about honor and duty that made Ned smile. Their journey would be an uncertain one, there was no guarantee they would ever return. Ned could not bring his entire family, nor could he even tell Cat fully the gravity of what he planned. The Lady of Winterfell had always been cold toward Jon, and Ned suspected that taking her husband's bastard to the far north on a mission more dangerous than any in living memory would sour her temper beyond mending. But it was not a matter of her feelings. Duty demanded something greater. They departed Winterfell under the cover of a storm-laden sky. Gray clouds threatened a late summer snow, though it was a rare thing so far south. The king in the north, though Ned had never claimed that title for himself, led the group, all dressed in black cloaks and furs thick enough to strangle a bear. They were a dozen men in total: Ned, Jon, a handful of loyal Stark guards, men like Tomard, Harwin, and other seasoned veterans, and 3 brothers of the Night's Watch who had come south to gather recruits. The watch was already stretched thin. If the rumors were true, if the White Walkers were no fable, then the watch would need swords, supplies, and strong leadership. Ned intended to give them all 3. Upon their arrival at Castle Black, the biting wind of the wall greeted them like an old foe. Ned had been here before, visiting his brother Benjen and renewing old friendships with Lord Commander Jeor Mormont. Yet this time felt different. The sense of foreboding was thick enough to taste. The Black brothers welcomed him with cautious respect. After all, the watch was neutral in matters of the realm, yet they knew they needed the support of a great northern lord. Jon Snow gazed in awe at the colossal curtain of ice towering into the sky, as if it were a monument to some forgotten god. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He had dreamed of this day for ages, and yet the reality of it, so impossibly vast, so cold, struck him silent. They spent the first nights behind the wall making preparations, ensuring that the men had the right boots, that the horses were well fed, that the blacksmith in residence had hammered out enough steel arrowheads to last them should they encounter the fabled others. Ned asked questions discreetly of rangers who had ventured beyond the wall. He listened to stories of eerie quiet in the haunted forest, of unexplained disappearances, of wildlings fleeing some terror they would not name. Many spoke of the dead rising, many more spoke of an everlasting winter that approached. The Lord Commander himself told Ned everything he knew, little enough but sufficient to paint the bleak picture. The watch's morale wavered and the men were on edge. They felt they were being abandoned by the realm. But with Ned Stark here, they had a glimmer of hope. Jon Snow found himself gravitating toward the company of Samwell Tarly, a brother of the Watch who had come north under painful circumstances of his own. Sam's gentle nature and insatiable curiosity about the world matched Jon's sense of wonder. At night, after training in the practice yard or finishing chores, the two would huddle by the library's dying embers and pore over old maps, some of which depicted the land beyond the wall with cryptic runes and incomplete sketches. The library at Castle Black was musty with disuse, but the dusty tomes and piles of scrolls were a treasure trove of legends. Jon read of the long night, of Azor Ahai, of the forging of Lightbringer. Sam, his plump hands trembling with excitement, showed him page after page of testimony from rangers of centuries past who claimed to have seen pale shadows moving among the snows or to have heard an otherworldly chorus echoing across the icy wastes. In time, the day came for Ned's expedition to set forth. They were to be guided by Corin Halfhand, a seasoned ranger who knew the mountains and valleys north of the wall better than any living man. Lord Commander Mormont insisted on sending a small ranger escort, men who were accustomed to the terrain and the dangers lurking in the shadow of the Frostfangs. The aim was to travel into the heart of the haunted forest, discover the truth behind the disturbing tales, and if possible, bring back any evidence that might convince even the Southern Lords that the White Walkers were no longer myths. Ned wanted to do more than simply gather evidence. He wanted to neutralize the threat before it had a chance to sweep down upon the realms of men. In his quiet moments, he worried he was overreaching, that he was stepping into a war that dwarfed mortal ambition. And yet, duty pushed him onward. The wind howled as they passed through the black gate beneath the wall, the secret entrance that only brothers of the Night's Watch could open. The horses nickered, their breath steaming in the cold. Even with the summer sun, this place felt like the belly of winter. Great pines, their limbs heavy with snow, pressed close. Sometimes, Ned thought he saw shapes lurking between the trunks, only to blink and find them gone. He kept his hand on the hilt of his sword, always. Jon rode beside him with Ghost trotting silently at their flank, the direwolf's red eyes scanning the trees with vigilant intensity. Their first nights beyond the wall were eerily uneventful. The rangers noted that the usual howls of wolves, the screeches of night birds, were absent. The forest seemed hushed, as though holding its breath, waiting for something. The men spoke little around the campfire. They grilled dried venison, sipped watered-down ale, and tried not to eye the darkness around them too often. Every now and then, Corin would mutter warnings about the silent night, or crouch down to examine footprints in the snow. Once, they came upon a wildling camp, abandoned in haste. The embers of the fire were cold, the shelters torn as though by some savage force. Jon nudged a battered child's doll with his boot, and its cracked face stared back at him, unsettling as any ghost. On the fourth day, they found bodies. 3 wildlings, half buried in a drift, their eyes wide with terror. No visible wounds marred them except for a faint blackening around their hands and feet, as though touched by frostbite. Their skin was clammy, their lips parted as if in silent screams. One of the rangers, a grim-faced man named Daniel, muttered a prayer to the old gods. Ned removed his glove and laid a hand upon one corpse's cheek. It was nearly as cold as the surrounding ice, and yet an indescribable chill prickled Ned's fingertips. The men gathered stones to build a small cairn, but in the end, Ned decided it was best to burn the bodies. There was no telling what might rise again in this terrible land. Jon doused them in oil, and Corin set a torch to their pyre. The air filled with the acrid stench of burnt flesh, and the entire company watched grimly, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. That night, Ned dreamed of swirling snow and pale figures gliding through the darkness. His sword felt heavy in his hand, and every breath turned to ice in his lungs. A shriek unearthly, piercing split the silence. He bolted upright, sweat chilling on his brow, and fumbled for his blade. Beside him, Jon was already awake, clutching his own sword and breathing hard as Ghost growled low. But the night was quiet once more, the only sound the rustle of the pines in the wind. The men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. They continued on, pushing deeper into the haunted forest. The terrain became more treacherous, the snowdrifts taller, the days growing shorter. The sky itself seemed darker, as though a gray veil of cloud had permanently settled above them. Sometimes they spotted ravens or crows perched on branches, watching silently. The rangers whispered that these were no ordinary birds, that they belonged to Bloodraven, the three-eyed crow of legend, though no one dared speak too openly of that. At times, Samwell Tarly, a surprise addition to the expedition that Ned hadn't initially planned, but the Lord Commander insisted Sam's knowledge might prove vital, would fall from his horse in a panic at the mere sight of shifting shadows. Jon would help him up, urging him on with quiet reassurance. At long last, they came upon a scattering of ruins built around a frozen lake, a place that might once have been a settlement in the distant past, back when the first men held dominion over these lands. The stone remnants of houses jutted from the snow and the roofs had collapsed ages ago. Corn suggested they make camp in one of the more stable structures for the night. The men pitched tents inside the ruined walls, forming a makeshift courtyard. Dark came swiftly. No moon shone. Their fires crackled, sending dancing shadows across the rubble. Ned stood watch alone for a time, wanting to gather his thoughts. The faint smell of pine smoke and horse sweat mingled in the air. Snow drifted lazily from the ink-black sky. He thought of Winterfell, of Cat and the children, of Sansa's delicate sewing and Arya's stubborn defiance, of Bran's wide-eyed curiosity, and of little Rickon clinging to his mother's skirts. Robb, too, nearing manhood, eager to prove himself worthy of the North. And here stood Ned, father to them all, risking his life in a frozen wasteland that might as well be the literal edge of the world. A surge of guilt curled in his stomach, but he pushed it aside with the knowledge that he did this for them and for all living things. If the threat were real, if the White Walkers were truly stirring, the safety of the realm demanded action. The silence was shattered by a scream. Ned spun, drawing his blade, and nearly dropped it as he saw the figure lunging through the darkness. One of the Stark guards, high tower shield dropped in the snow, was being dragged toward the trees by something pale and lithe. He barely got a glimpse before the gloom swallowed them both. Then came shouting, the sounds of steel scraping from scabbards, the panicked neighing of horses. Ghost bounded past Ned, white fur bristling, a streak of primal fury. Jon Snow rushed out of the ruins, eyes wide, sword in hand. Corran bellowed orders for the men to form a circle. In the flickering firelight, Ned saw movement again, pale shapes at the edge of vision, slender limbs, reflective eyes like chips of ice. The air temperature seemed to drop in an instant. The men breathed ragged clouds, their skin prickling as if needles of frost stabbed them. From somewhere behind a half-collapsed wall, Sam let out a startled yelp and an inhuman rasping hiss answered. Ned realized it was happening. The White Walkers had come. He had never seen anything like them before. They were tall, impossibly graceful, their flesh seeming almost translucent, smooth as glass. Armor of strange, icy crystal clung to their frames, refracting the firelight in shimmering rainbows. Their eyes blazed with a blue so intense it felt like staring into the heart of an Arctic sea. One carried a spear of something that looked like pale, enchanted ice, the other wielded a slender sword that caught the light in ghostly flickers. There was a moment, a singular, terrifying moment, when man and myth stared at each other across the broken stones. Then steel rang on ice. The fight was desperate and brutal. At first contact, one of the rangers, a brawny man named Daniel, swung his longsword at a walker's midsection. The blade met that icy sword and shattered, shards spinning away in a deadly arc. Daniel stumbled back, eyes wide with fear, then screamed as the White Walker's weapon slashed across his torso. A thin line of frost traced the cut, and the ranger collapsed, choking on frozen air. Another brother tried shooting an arrow, but the projectile snapped in half against the walker's unnatural armor. Ned charged, heart thundering, Valyrian steel in hand, ice, the ancient great sword of House Stark, though he rarely carried it into battle himself. It weighed heavily, but it was their best chance. With every fiber of his being, he swung. The White Walker moved with a speed that defied sense, parrying in a swirl of motion. A jolt of force vibrated up Ned's arms, and he nearly lost his grip. But ice did not shatter. Instead, it met the Walker's blade in a clash of sparks, and for an instant, the Walker's unearthly face twitched in what might have been surprise. Jon Snow sprang at the second Walker, longclaw in hand, though not yet the Valyrian steel version given by Mormont, as that gift had not occurred in this altered timeline. He had a castle-forged blade, strong but standard steel, and that could mean death. Still, Jon refused to waver, slashing and cutting with all the ferocity he could muster. The Walker batted away his attempts like a cat might toy with a mouse, each motion fluid and almost casual. But Ghost intervened, launching himself at the Walker's flank. The direwolf's teeth found purchase for only an instant before the creature flung Ghost aside with frightening ease. Ned fought like he had never fought before, the memory of Robert Baratheon's rebellion far behind him. This was no mortal foe, this was something else, something older and darker. He grit his teeth, mustering all his strength in a downward strike. To his astonishment, the White Walker's blade cracked under ice's impact, splintering like frozen glass. Blue-white shards rained down, and the creature let out a hiss that curdled Ned's blood. Then, in a swift motion, Ned reversed his grip and drove ice straight through its chest. For half a heartbeat, the Walker locked eyes with him, its gaze chilling Ned's very soul. Then the Walker's body crumbled, collapsing into sparkling fragments that hissed as they met the snow. They melted away, leaving behind only a faint stain of icy moisture. The second Walker, the one Jon faced, paused as if sensing its companion's destruction. It glanced toward Ned, a flicker of something like contempt crossing its alien features. Sam, in an act that must have taken all the courage in his body, flung a torch toward it. The walker stepped aside gracefully, the flame sputtering in the snow, but it gave Jon enough of a distraction to scramble for a different blade. He grabbed one from a fallen ranger, not even sure of its make. The walker advanced, raising that terrible sword of ice. Yet before it could strike, Qhorin half-hand lunged from the side, a dragoglass dagger clutched in his fist. He drove the black blade into the walker's flank. A shriek of unimaginable pitch tore the night asunder, and the walker reeled, allowing Jon a chance to bury his borrowed blade in its torso. The effect was immediate. The walker began to crack and shimmer, its form disintegrating like fragile frost beneath a hot sun. In seconds, it was gone. Silence, or near silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of frightened men, by Sam's sobbing, by the crackle of dying torches in the snow. Bodies littered the ruins. At least 4 of the expedition's men lay slain. Daniel's eyes were frozen open, a thin rim of frost along his lashes. Another had lost his head entirely. 2 more were simply missing, dragged off into the trees by God knew what. Ned closed his eyes briefly, grief gripping his heart. These men had followed him here, trusting in his leadership. He had led them into an otherworldly nightmare. Yet they had survived the first encounter, and that was no small thing. Ned tended to the wounded with shaking hands. Jon cradled Ghost's head, checking for injuries. The direwolf whimpered but could stand, bruised but alive. Qhorin, grim-faced, gave brief instructions to gather the fallen and burn them. None of them wanted to consider the possibility that their own men might rise anew as whites. The bodies of the White Walkers had left only tiny pools of water in the snow, so ephemeral, so inhuman. Samwell Tarly couldn't stop shuddering. 7 hells, he kept repeating, tears streaming down cheeks turned ruddy by the cold. They're real. They're real. In the aftermath, Ned felt an odd mixture of horror and triumph. They had encountered the White Walkers and lived. That meant it could be done. But at what cost? And how many more were out there in the icy wastes, gathering their forces, conjuring horrors even worse than themselves? The men huddled in the ruin, building a roaring fire, looting whatever salvageable items they could from the remains of the wildlings who must have once inhabited this place. Horses had bolted during the fight, meaning they would travel on foot unless they could find the animals. Morale was shaken. And yet, Qhorin insisted that they press forward. If they could find a main encampment of White Walkers or gather enough proof, maybe that knowledge would be enough to bring the entire North to arms. Ned suspected it would take more than that to convince the Iron Throne. With dawn came a weak, gray light that did little to dispel the gloom. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the carnage of the night before. They burned their dead. The acrid smoke rose to a colorless sky. Ned watched the flames dance around the features of men he'd known, men who had served him loyally. He vowed to remember their names and to see that their families were provided for if he returned alive. Jon stood nearby, silent, face drawn with grief. This was the boy's first experience with the true horrors of the world. Battle against a living foe was one thing, facing inhuman terrors was another. Still, there was a set to Jon's jaw, a determination in his eyes that filled Ned with a quiet pride. They pressed deeper north. Now, every step brought with it the sense of being watched by something hidden among the trees. The wind carried strange echoes. At times, it sounded almost like laughter, cold, malevolent. They found footprints in the snow that vanished abruptly, no sign of where the owners had gone. Once, Qhorin discovered a circle of carved symbols etched into the trunk of a weirwood, symbols that seemed older than any known writing. The sap from the weirwood's carved face bled red tears down the bark. They moved on, hearts heavy with dread. Eventually, they reached a high ridge overlooking a valley that stretched toward distant mountains. In the valley below, they saw movement, figures trudging through the snow, their gait unnatural. Through a borrowed Myrish lens, Ned counted at least 24 shapes. Some were wildlings or had been, their flesh blue-tinged, their eyes milky white. Whites raised from death to serve the White Walkers' will. The men took cover, peering from behind stunted evergreens. The small host of whites was accompanied by at least 2 more White Walkers gliding silently among their undead thralls. The rangers' breath caught in their throats. Here was a threat far greater than even Ned had anticipated. If those creatures continued south, if they spread their influence, an army of the dead could swell to catastrophic numbers. They could not confront so many directly, not without more men and more weapons of Valyrian steel or dragoglass. Qhorin pointed to a narrow pass in the distance. "We should skirt around them," he said quietly, "keep out of sight, see if we can reach Craster's Keep or another hideout where we might find some shelter or information." Ned agreed. Their priority now was survival and reconnaissance, not open battle. The men withdrew, careful to muffle their steps, leading the few recovered horses by the reins. Daylight hours were tense, each moment anticipating the shrill cry of a walker or the moan of a white. Mercifully, they avoided detection, though twice they had to conceal themselves behind rocky outcroppings while white walkers glided by on an adjacent ridge. The men pressed against the cold stone, hearts hammering, as the unnatural footsteps passed within earshot. Once Ned nearly reached for his sword, half expecting a sudden assault. But the watchers moved on. It seemed that, for the moment at least, the others were occupied with their own mysterious designs. At dusk, the expedition found an overhang beneath which they could shelter from the wind. They lit no fire lest the glow draw attention. The temperature dropped drastically without that comforting warmth, but they huddled together, wrapping themselves in furs and clasping hands to share body heat. Sam's teeth chattered so loudly John thought it might echo through the valley. Ned pressed his back against John's, hoping the contact would keep them both from freezing. Every man was exhausted, but few slept. The watchers in the dark never truly left their minds. Hours later, Ned slipped into a restless doze and dreamed of Winterfell's crypts. He wandered among the statues of dead Stark kings, their stone eyes following him. Then the crypt opened into a vast, icy wasteland. Blue-eyed corpses reached for him with skeletal hands. He heard a voice, faint and distant. "Winter is coming. Winter is here." He woke with a start, cold sweat mingling with the frost on his brow. Across from him, John was awake, staring into the blackness. They exchanged a look, no words spoken, but each knew what haunted the other's mind. They rose at first light and carried on, forging a winding path through the rugged terrain. The wind picked up, whipping icy crystals at their faces. Travel was slow, and the men were beginning to show signs of weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue. The creeping dread gnawed at them, a constant companion. Corrin pointed out sets of tracks in the snow, some human, some belonging to beasts. More disturbingly, tracks that belonged to neither. Perhaps great bears or something more sinister. By the time they reached the narrow pass Corrin had mentioned, a snowstorm was brewing. Thick flakes fell in rapid succession, blurring the world into a white haze. They struggled on, leaning into the gale. Sam stumbled repeatedly, but John always hauled him up. Ned admired their bond. In the swirl of snow, they nearly missed the structure ahead, a crude wooden shack, half buried by drifts. A gnarled tree grew beside it, twisted branches brushing a sagging roof. No lights glimmered within. The men paused, exchanging uncertain looks. Could it be a wildling shelter? A trap? Eventually, they decided to investigate. The storm was too fierce to continue marching blindly. Inside the shack, it was dark and reeked of old rot. Broken furniture, scattered furs, the remains of some long-dead occupant. No fresh food. Yet it offered walls and a roof, meager protection though they were. The men erected a makeshift barrier around the entrance to keep out some of the snow and wind. Within, they managed a small, shielded fire. The gloom pressed in as the storm's howl built outside. Night fell, though it was hard to distinguish from day in that blizzard. Tired and desperate for relief, they took turns resting. Sam coughed, his body trembling, and John worried he might fall gravely ill. In the middle of the night, with the wind still shrieking, Ned thought he heard scraping at the walls. He sat bolt upright, hand on his sword hilt, but saw only swirling drifts through the shack's many gaps. Another trick of the wind, he told himself. He settled down again, though his heart would not be calmed. He could not help but recall the stories old Nan used to tell. He remembered the hush in Winterfell's great hall when she would speak of the Night's King, the others, and the horrors that walked in the darkness. And here he was, living that legend. When dawn finally broke, the storm had lessened, though the wind still carried a faint wail. The men emerged to find the drifts piled waist-high, forcing them to dig out the horses and clear a path. It took hours, during which time their beards and eyebrows froze with crusted ice. Corrin scouted ahead once more, returning with the news that the pass was blocked by an avalanche. They would have to skirt around it, if possible, a delay of at least a day. Ned could see the dismay in every face. Time was not on their side. And so they trudged on. The day wore into afternoon with no respite. Snow-laden branches bent overhead, occasionally snapping under the weight and crashing down with startling force. Once, a fallen trunk nearly took out Sam, but John yanked him aside in time. The gloom of the forest felt suffocating, as though it were swallowing them. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, they spotted flickers of light through the tree's firelight. Corrin motioned for silence, and they advanced cautiously. They found a ring of wildlings, at least a dozen men, women, and children huddled around a large campfire in a clearing. Makeshift tents and lean-tos surrounded them. From the looks of it, they'd been traveling south in a hurry. The wildlings spotted the black-cloaked party immediately, jumping to their feet, grabbing crude spears and axes. An uneasy standoff ensued, each side eyeing the other warily. Ned stepped forward, raising a hand in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. "We are not your enemies," he called out, voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "We mean you no harm." A tall wildling man, face painted with swirling lines of ash, sneered. "Men of the Crow, we want no part of you." But a woman beside him, clutching a young child, spoke in a trembling voice. "We've seen the dead," she said. "We've seen them rising. The others took my man." Ned removed his glove, showing them the Stark sigil on his cloak pin. "I am Eddard Stark, Warden of the North. I know your plight. We have come to stop the White Walkers, or at least to learn how. Let us share your fire." A tense silence followed. The wildlings glanced at each other. Then a wizened old woman among them nodded slowly. "Stark," she whispered. "I've heard tales of your house, said to be honorable." She looked about at her ragged companions. "Let them sit. If they do us harm, we have little to lose. The dead are the true enemy now." Cautiously, the two groups merged around the fire. The wildlings offered bits of salted meat. One man passed around a battered flask of something that burned like strong spirits. Ned accepted it with thanks, wincing as it scorched his throat. He explained as simply as he could the threat they'd encountered. The wildlings spoke of entire villages swept away, of children taken in the night, of how the others came with the cold. They told of monstrous spiders, of shadows that moved on their own, and of white-eyed wights prowling the tundra. Some might have been exaggerations, but Ned sensed genuine terror in their voices. One wildling, who introduced himself as Harith, admitted to having stored a cache of dragonglass arrowheads in a hidden cave, bartered from men at Harhome. He offered to trade them if Ned could promise safe passage south of the wall. Ned hesitated. He held no official authority to make such a promise. But the Night's Watch needed allies now more than ever, and the wildlings could not be left to die. He said, "If we can convince the Lord Commander, I will do all in my power to see you through. We share a common enemy." John stiffened beside him, recalling that the Watch technically forbade such alliances. Yet these were extraordinary circumstances. Before they could discuss further, one of the wildling lookouts returned, breathless and wide-eyed, pointing toward the darkness. "They're coming," he gasped. "I saw one, pale as bone, eyes like frost. It's not far." Panic rippled through the group. Some of the wildlings wanted to run, but to where? Ned set his jaw and took charge. "We'll stand together. Form a perimeter. Keep the children in the center by the fire. If you have dragonglass, distribute it now." Corin, battered from the journey, still had presence of mind to assist, organizing the rangers to stand guard. John helped pass out weapons, whatever they had: spears, axes, a handful of arrows. Sam fumbled a small pouch of dragonglass arrowheads, dropping half of them in the snow. John picked them up patiently, pressing them into Sam's trembling hand. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet again. It was that same suffocating silence from before, the hush that preceded death. The men and women gathered around the fire, eyes darting between the trees. The children whimpered. One mother tried to hush her babe, but the infant's cries pierced the stillness. Then, from out of the darkness, a shape emerged. It was not a White Walker, but a white, once a wildling, now a shambling husk with skin stretched tight and blackened over its skull. Fingers crooked, nails broken, it lurched forward, dead eyes locked on the living. The wildlings screamed, but Ned shouted for them to hold their line. A watchman shot a dragonglass-dipped arrow, striking the white in the chest. It staggered, letting out a hideous moan, then collapsed as the black glass did its work. Before they could breathe a sigh of relief, more emerged, several from each side of the clearing, half buried by the swirling snow. Their growls formed a ghastly chorus. The living souls huddled around the fire found themselves surrounded. Chaos erupted. The men swung axes, spears, swords. The wildlings fought like cornered beasts, shrieking war cries. Corin barked orders, but it was nearly impossible to maintain any formation. Sam fumbled with his bow, dropping arrows in the snow, while John tried to fend off two whites simultaneously, yelling at the top of his lungs. Ned moved like a man possessed, parrying the slash of a skeletal arm, hacking through a rotting torso. Whenever a white went down, they ensured to stab it again with dragonglass or, lacking that, set it aflame. The stench of decay and burning flesh was overwhelming. Then he appeared. Another White Walker, gliding into the fray, tall and regal in bearing. Frost clung to its pale armor and its eyes glowed that impossible blue. Every living warrior seemed to feel its presence like a dagger of ice pressing against their hearts. Two whites flanked it, but they parted as it strode forward, arrogant in its gait. It surveyed the ring of fighters, selecting its next victim. Ned stepped up to meet it, ice at the ready. His breath billowed before him in great clouds. Once again, he felt that primal terror gripping him. But he could not yield. The walker raised its sword of ice, translucent as glass. Ned braced for the clash, praying that his Valyrian steel would hold true again. Their blades met. A resonant ring echoed through the clearing, sending sparks of frost. The walker pressed forward with inhuman strength, forcing Ned back a step. Ned grimaced, tightening his grip, pushing back with all his might. The creature's face showed no emotion, only a cold, malevolent focus. Ned twisted away, forcing the walker's blade aside, and countered with a sweeping slash that would have cleaved a mortal man in two. The walker caught ice on its own blade, the impact rattling Ned's bones. This foe was more skilled than the last one. Panic fluttered in Ned's chest, but he pushed it down, concentrating on each stroke, each parry. Jon Snow, meanwhile, desperately fought through the crowd of wights, trying to reach Ned's side. Ghost tore into undead limbs, scattering them across the snow, but the direwolf was forced to keep moving lest the horde overrun him. A wildling woman fired an arrow that whizzed past Jon's ear, piercing a wight through the eye. Sam fended off another wight with a torch, shrieking at it to stay back. Across the flames, Corrin was locked in combat with a second White Walker that had emerged, brandishing a spear of glimmering ice. The entire clearing had become a battlefield of death and swirling snow, the storm intensifying once more. Ned ducked a slash that hummed past his head. The White Walker pressed its advantage, striking with rapid, elegant blows that forced Ned to expend all his skill simply to keep from being skewered. His arms ached, muscles trembling. He managed to land a glancing blow that chipped the walker's icy armor, but it retaliated with a lightning-fast thrust that sliced Ned's thigh. A wave of cold shot up his leg, nearly buckling his knee. He stumbled, breath ragged. The walker advanced, blade raised for a killing stroke. Ned saw death in those blue eyes. Then a roar cut through the chaos. Ghost lunged, tackling the walker from behind. The creature staggered. Jon arrived a heartbeat later, thrusting at the walker's torso with a dragaglass dagger in his offhand. The walker spun gracefully, batting Ghost aside, but the dagger tip grazed its side, sending a shard of freezing energy crackling through the air. The walker hissed, stepping back. Ned seized the opportunity, ignoring the pain in his leg, and swung ice with both hands in a powerful, sweeping arc. The Valyrian steel bit into the walker's shoulder, slicing down through the chest. A shriek like shattering glass burst from its lips. The walker imploded in a burst of icy shards, a sound like tinkling crystals. Silence followed in the immediate vicinity, as though the forest itself paused to witness the demise of such a being. Their victory was not yet secure. The wights still surged around them, but once the White Walker fell, some of the undead minions faltered, as if their guiding spirit had been severed. A few collapsed outright. Others staggered aimlessly, making them easier to dispatch. Across the clearing, Corrin managed to drive his spear, a dragonglass tip affixed, through the second walker's chest. With a final, echoing wail, that walker too disintegrated into shards of ice. At last, the survivors put down the remaining wights with a grim, methodical efficiency. When the sounds of battle subsided, a hush fell, broken only by ragged breathing and weeping. Bodies, dead for the final time, littered the snow. The wildlings' camp was in disarray. Tents trampled, the fire scattered. Many of the wildlings had perished, but some still lived, clinging to one another in shock. The men of the Night's Watch and the Stark Guards were similarly battered. Ned sank to his knees, pressing a hand to his thigh wound. Blood pulsed between his fingers, but the cold had partly numbed the pain. He looked up at Jon, who knelt beside him, face pale and eyes wide. "Father," Jon said, the word slipping out before he could think to correct it to "my lord." Fear and concern warred in his gaze. "You're hurt." Ned grimaced a smile. "I've been better," but he placed a comforting hand on Jon's shoulder. "You saved me, both you and Ghost. I owe you my life." Jon's eyes glimmered, a mix of pride and desperation. He tore a strip of cloth from his cloak to bind Ned's wound. Around them a few men gathered. Corrin, bloodied but alive, surveyed the clearing. "It won't be long before more show up. We should move." Ned nodded, though he felt lightheaded. "We need to find real shelter, someplace we can defend, or we must return to the wall and warn the realm. The threat is too great to linger." The wildlings who remained had nowhere else to go. Ned reiterated his promise to do what he could for them if they traveled south with the watch. Some agreed. Others refused to trust any crow or kneeler, but a few eventually put aside pride in the face of apocalyptic danger. The group set to clearing what they could, salvaging supplies from the battered camp. Ned tried to stand, but he wobbled, so Jon and Qhorin helped him onto one of the surviving horses. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground in a fresh layer of white that disguised the carnage beneath. 2 days later, the battered expedition finally emerged from the pass into a region closer to Craster's Keep, though that place had its own perils as Craster was a loathsome man. But it meant some respite from the open wilderness. Along the way, they lost another man to his wounds. He died in the night, and Ned had him burned at dawn, just in case. They were forced to fend off several more whites in smaller skirmishes, and each time Ned marveled that they were still alive. The White Walkers themselves seemed to be massing, or scouting, or performing some unknown strategy in the wilderness. Ned recalled how dangerously close the realm was to ignoring all of this, how a single letter from the Lord Commander might be dismissed by the Southern Lords as superstition. Finally, they reached the rough-hewn palisade of Craster's Keep, greeted by suspicious eyes peering over the ramparts. Craster himself, a squat man with a face like a boiled ham, grudgingly allowed them inside only after a heated exchange. He recognized Qhorin and sneered at the sight of the wildlings with them. But he was outnumbered, and even Craster knew better than to provoke a group of armed men led by Eddard Stark, especially given the dire news they carried. They secured a small corner of the yard to rest. Ned nearly collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss, and Jon insisted that Sam fetch bandages and what passed for a poultice from Craster's meager stores. Grimly, Sam set about cleaning and dressing Ned's wound as best he could. That night, the wind carried the distant howls of dire wolves or something worse across the snowy plains. Craster's wives, wearing haunted expressions, moved silently about their tasks. Occasionally, Ned caught them casting fearful glances at him or Jon, or at Sam, as if they suspected the presence of the White Walkers was the only reason these crows had come so far. And they were right, in a sense. Over a meal of thin stew, Ned discussed the best course with Qhorin. "We have our proof," Ned said, voice low to keep Craster's prying ears away. "More than proof. We fought them. Others can't deny the truth now. We must get back to Castle Black with as many survivors as possible. Gather the entire watch and send word to every lord in Westeros. If we do not unite, we will all die." Qhorin nodded. "We'll need your help, Lord Stark. No one's voice in the north is stronger than yours. Maybe your lord's bannermen will believe you. And maybe with the might of the north, we can convince the rest of Westeros." Ned stared into the flickering fire, shadows dancing across his face. "I will do everything in my power, but we cannot rely solely on southern assistance. Robert Baratheon might be my friend, but he cares little for what he considers northern folly. And there are other forces in the south, schemers who care only for the Iron Throne. Still, we must try." Jon, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "What if the White Walkers come in greater numbers before we can rally enough support? Castle Black isn't prepared for such a war." Ned placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Then we fight them at the wall, for as long as we can, and hope that every man in the realm will heed our call before it's too late. We have no other choice." Thus, the plan was set. The next morning, Craster sent them away with gruff disdain, though not before extorting a few trinkets and promises from them to leave him be. The man was vile, but Ned had to set aside disgust for practicality's sake. Their group, diminished yet resolute, set out southward. The wildlings who had chosen to come with them hoped for a better chance at life behind the wall than in the haunted forest. The going was slow, but Ned's leg wound improved enough that he could ride with less pain. Jon and the other men took turns scouting ahead, wary of any sign of pursuit. A chill wind dogged them as though winter itself had taken notice of their presence. They marched through forests and frozen riverbeds, always on high alert. The losses weighed heavy on Ned. Every step reminded him of the men who had died under his command. Every gust of wind seemed to echo their ghosts. Yet he also felt a swelling sense of responsibility beyond anything he had shouldered before. This was not just about protecting House Stark or even the North. This was about the survival of all men, wildling and crow, king and peasant alike. Days and nights blurred together until at last the Great Wall loomed in the distance, its icy height stretching into the clouded sky like a white, unbreakable barrier between the realms of men and the endless dark beyond. The sight stirred Ned's heart. Castle Black stood in the wall's shadow, black stone stark against the frozen wilderness. Ravens circled overhead, their caws echoing. Even from afar, the group could sense activity, tension. The gates opened to allow them entry, and the men of the watch rushed to greet them, relief and alarm mingling on their faces. News traveled quickly. Ned Stark had returned, battered from battle with the White Walkers, accompanied by living wildlings. The Lord Commander Jeor Mormont came to greet them in person. He embraced Ned in a gruff warrior's hug, then stepped back to examine the sorry state of the expedition. When Ned told him everything, quietly, carefully, Mormont's weathered face grew grimmer still. Yet he betrayed no surprise. He had suspected something of this magnitude. The old bear simply nodded. We've been receiving more and more reports of sightings of white attacks. I fear this is only the beginning. Ned gathered the garrison in the courtyard. Jon Snow stood behind him, arms crossed, Ghost at his side. Sam lingered near the front, quivering slightly but determined to bear witness. Corran, bandaged but unbowed, flanked Ned, as did the surviving Stark guards. The wildlings who had joined them hung back, uneasy under the watchful eyes of Castle Black's archers. Ned raised his voice so that all assembled could hear. Men of the Night's Watch, good people of the North, I have seen the enemy. The White Walkers are no myth. They walk again, and with them come the Whites, the dead that do not rest. We have lost good men to them. I have fought them with my own sword, and I assure you they can be defeated, but not easily, and not without the right weapons. We have precious little Valyrian steel left in the world, and not nearly enough dragonglass. If these others come in force, we will need the strength of all Westeros to hold them back. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He saw fear in their eyes, yes, but also resolve. These men had taken the black, sworn oaths to defend the realms of men. Even if their numbers were small, their courage might yet bolster them. I will do what I must, Ned continued. I will send ravens to every corner of the realm, to the lords of the north and to King Robert himself, beseeching aid. We must fortify the wall, man the abandoned castles, gather weapons of dragonglass from Dragonstone if possible, and search for any method to fight this ancient foe. You who stand watch here must stand firm. We will do what we can to bring you reinforcements. But above all else, you must not doubt that the threat is real. A murmur rippled through the courtyard. Some men clenched their fists, others whispered prayers. Jon Snow felt a surge of fierce pride in his father, the man he had always admired, even from the uncertain vantage of a bastard's place. This was Ned Stark in his truest form, honorable, unwavering in the face of the greatest danger. When Ned finished, Mormont raised his voice. All will heed Lord Stark's words. Prepare yourselves. We face a winter unlike any in living memory, and an enemy older than the first men. The Night's Watch will stand, as we have for thousands of years. Applause was sparse. This was no joyous occasion, but the men gave a solemn acknowledgement, their hearts filling with a new sense of purpose. Over the following days, Ned wrote letters, sealing them with the direwolf sigil, dispatching ravens to Winterfell, the Eyrie, Riverrun, and King's Landing. He penned personal pleas to Stannis and Renly Baratheon, to Tywin Lannister, to every major house. In each, he described the sightings, the battles, the fallen men who had been raised again, the White Walkers' vulnerability to Valyrian steel and dragonglass. He invoked the oath that all men must rise against the darkness. He spared no detail that might rouse them from disbelief. Yet he knew many would not believe. King Robert might dismiss it as a ghost story, though perhaps Ned's standing as a dear friend might encourage him to at least investigate. The Lannisters were unlikely to care unless it threatened their power. The Tyrells might see an opportunity to win favor, and so on. The realm was a tapestry of conflicting interests. Still, Ned did all he could, for the alternative was unimaginable. Meanwhile, the wildlings who had come with him were allowed temporary refuge near the Shadow Tower, grudgingly so. Diplomacy was strained, as the Watch had always considered wildlings to be enemies, but a deeper foe demanded unity. Ned recognized that bridging centuries of hostility would be no simple task, yet he also saw hope in the few who had joined them. So long as they recognized a common cause, they could stand side by side. Jon Snow found a renewed sense of belonging at Castle Black in those days. He worked tirelessly, drilling with other recruits, training them to fight with dragonglass weapons, practicing archery, swordsmanship, anything that might help when the White Walkers inevitably returned in force. Ghost prowled the courtyards, a silent sentinel that sometimes startled the new recruits. Samwell Tarly, too, was spurred to action, digging through ancient records for references to the others and how they might be stopped. Together, they found cryptic passages suggesting that spells and wards had once been woven into the foundations of the wall, that the children of the forest had aided in such enchantments. No one was certain how much of that magic remained. As Ned recuperated from his wound, he oversaw these preparations with grim determination. He knew the White Walkers would not remain idle. Word reached them of villages far north of the wall going silent. Rangers continued to disappear on patrols. Scouts reported whites in small clusters, stragglers from some larger horde. The land beyond the wall was becoming a domain of the dead, creeping ever closer. After a fortnight, a raven arrived from Winterfell. Maester Luwin wrote that the castle was mobilizing. Robb had begun gathering the Stark bannermen, marshalling them to ride north. The Karstarks, Umbers, Manderleys, and other great houses of the north had pledged their men. The letter was cautious but resolute. They believed Ned, and they would come. Ned felt a swell of relief, though he worried about placing his son in such a pivotal role. But Robb was nearly of age, and the North needed leadership in the field while Ned remained at the wall. Day by day, ravens trickled in from other lords. Many offered polite disbelief, but a few, like the Tullis and the Arryns, promised to investigate. King Robert's reply was short and curt. Ned, I value your word above others. I ride for the North with the might of the crown. By the time you read this, we will be on the King's Road. Ned nearly wept with relief, for Robert was brash, but he was not a man to leave a friend forsaken. If the king truly marched, that would lend serious weight to the threat. Others might follow, if only to remain in the king's favor. Yet as the days turned colder, Ned felt the creeping sense that time was running out. One crisp morning, a horn blast shattered the quiet of Castle Black. Guards rushed along the ramparts, eyes straining northward. Ned hurried to see what alarmed them. Through the swirling snow on the far side of the wall, there were lights, bluish glimmers, bobbing in the distance as if a ghostly procession marched south. Rangers peering through the Myrish lens described whites, dozens, hundreds perhaps, in the gloom. Leading them, tall figures that glowed like moonlight on ice, White Walkers in numbers far beyond anything seen so far. The men of the Night's Watch stood tense, the horns still echoing. Ned Stark gazed down from atop the wall, his breath frosting in the air, heart pounding. So it began, he thought. They were coming in earnest. The Great War was upon them. Below, he heard Corran rallying the archers, heard Sam stammering about the dragonglass supply, heard Jon calling for men to brace themselves. The tension was a physical force in the cold air. Ned shut his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer to the old gods. He had done all he could to warn the realm. Now it was time to stand and fight, to hold the line at the ancient wall that had protected humankind for thousands of years. He opened his eyes, stared into the distant shapes with unwavering resolve. For the living, he murmured, gripping the hilt of his sword. For Winterfell. For all the realms of men. I will not fail. Thus, the stage was set for the battle that would decide the fate of Westeros. Ned Stark and Jon Snow, side by side atop the wall, the Night's Watch around them, the North rallying to their cause. And the White Walkers advancing from the frozen wastes with an army of the dead. Honor, duty, and love all converged in that moment, and Ned Stark vowed that even if the world froze over, even if the darkest winter descended, he would not yield. The white winds blew, the horns echoed, and the watchers on the wall prepared to face the ancient cold that threatened to engulf them all. Ned Stark stood atop the wall, the chill wind peeling back the loose strands of his dark hair now streaked with gray. Beneath him stretched a vast whiteness, snow-covered forests, frozen rivers, skeletal trees, and beyond them the faint silhouettes of mountains. The setting sun had cast the sky in an unsettling mixture of gray and pale purple. Twilight was settling in, and the lights in the distance, those eerie blue flares the Rangers had spotted, still pulsed, as if the dead themselves were sending signals across the ice. The cold bit deeper than ever, a sharp reminder that the true winter was only beginning. Around Ned, the men of the Night's Watch moved with measured urgency, uncoiling ropes, locking ballistae into place, checking arrow fletchings. Jon Snow appeared at Ned's side. He looked exhausted, yet a fire burned behind his dark eyes. Ghost padded in Jon's wake, the direwolf's white coat blending with the snow that drifted across the ice-slick stones of the walkway. Jon leaned over the crenellations and narrowed his eyes. In the distance, he could see shadows shifting along the tree line, as though the wind itself carried an army forward. The flickers of unnatural bluish light, like cold flames trapped in some glass orb, grew brighter or perhaps closer. "They're on the move," Jon said, voice hushed. His breath frosted in the air, nearly white as ghost's fur. Ned nodded, keeping his gaze locked forward. "We have fewer men than we need to hold this entire stretch of the wall," he said quietly. "Corrin's rangers confirmed that we have at least 3 or 4 separate gatherings of whites and white walkers, all within a day's travel. The biggest force is the one we saw to the north. The question is whether they'll coordinate their attacks or strike from multiple points." Jon exhaled slowly. "Lord Commander Mormont is sending word to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower. They'll try to reinforce us, but it's a lot of ground to cover." Ned recognized the tinge of fear beneath Jon's words. They all felt it, only fools would not. But the best remedy for fear was action. "We hold them as best we can until our allies arrive. That's all we can do." The wind picked up, rattling the torch brackets. "And allies will come, Jon," Ned said, reading his son's worry. "Your brother is mustering the banners in the north. My friend, King Robert, has written that he marches. We'll see the Baratheon banners soon enough. We have to hope it's in time." Jon gave a curt nod. He pressed his lips together as if considering some unspoken thought. "If they break through before help arrives," Ned's jaw tightened. "Then we fight. We fight until our last breath. This is the line that must not break." The wind seemed to sigh in agreement, carrying the distant sound of war horns, deep and resonant. The horns from the top of the wall echoed back. Their calls reached outward, letting the world know that the Watchers had seen the threat. Night was falling fast now, ushered in by a dim hush that was all the more terrifying for what it concealed. Below, in the courtyard of Castle Black, preparations were in full swing. Men in black cloaks heaved barrels of oil onto lifts, securing them for deployment atop the wall. Others shuttled bundles of dragonglass weapons, arrowheads, spear tips, small daggers. The supply was limited, a pitiful stash to face an army of the dead. Samwell Tarly stood by one pile, sweaty-faced and red-cheeked despite the cold, marking inventory on a wax tablet. Each time a crate was lifted upward, he gave a frantic nod, urging the brothers to be gentle with it. His knowledge of the others had become crucial. He had found references to the power of dragonglass in ancient annals, but no single text told them everything. He only knew that the White Walkers hated the volcanic glass and that whites could be kept down if their bodies were destroyed or burned. The Stark guards who had accompanied Ned beyond the wall were battered but determined. Harwin, whose shoulder had been gashed in the last skirmish, still insisted on helping lash barrels in place. Tomard, limping slightly from frostbite, growled encouragement to younger recruits. The wildlings who had chosen to throw their lot in with the watch stayed mostly separate from the black-clad men, but they were here, too, rolling up makeshift ropes, sharpening axes, or pacing anxiously with their crude spears. Some spat at the ground whenever they caught a brother of the watch staring. The fear of the White Walkers overrode old hatreds for the moment, at least. In the Lord Commander's solar and impromptu war council had assembled around a battered wooden table. A single brazier gave some semblance of warmth, but the men could still see their breath in the flickering light. Gior, Old Bear Mormont stood at the head, his broad shoulders hunched, gray hair ragged, the lines of his face carved deep by worry and cold. Ned sat on a stool, leg extended to ease the ache of the healing wound in his thigh. Jon stood by the door, listening. Corrin Halfhand stood across from Mormont, gesturing at a map with calloused fingers. Sam hovered, along with a few high-ranking officers of the Watch, Bowen Marsh among them, face grim and red. "All reports suggest multiple clusters of whites," Corrin said in a low, steady voice. "Some near the Millwater, some closer to Whitetree. We've spotted them from the top of the wall, drifting like ghosts along the forest edge. The largest force is directly north of us, though, and that's likely where at least 2 White Walkers lead them. Possibly more. We can't tell for certain. It's hard to guess their true numbers." Lord Commander Mormont tapped a gloved finger against the map where he had scrawled makeshift black lines indicating enemy sightings. "It looks like they're converging," he said, voice as gravelly as the shifting ice. The question is, will they attempt to breach the wall itself? Or find a pass around it, like the gorge near the Shadow Tower or the coastline by Eastwatch? Ned spoke up. They might do both. We've never known the White Walkers' full capabilities. But if they can find a weak point, or if they sense we're undermanned, they'll exploit it. The scattered castles along the wall are near empty. Even if Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower muster, we have few men to spare for the others. He gestured at the quills marking those old strongholds: Greyguard, Queen's Gate, Deep Lake, abandoned and in disrepair. Mormont grimaced. Aye, that's a problem. The Night's Watch was meant to be thousands strong, manning every fortress. We're a shadow of what we once were. He paused, jaw clenched. But we can't yield. Not to these creatures. Bowen Marsh cleared his throat. Even if we keep them from crossing the wall directly, some might slip through if the wildlings to the northwest have cut secret paths. Or if the White Walkers can use their sorcery somehow. We know so little. John felt ice coil in his belly at the reminder that the White Walkers possessed powers unknown to mortal men. The strange illusions, the freezing cold that accompanied them, the ability to raise the dead. Who knew what else they could do? He looked at Corin, who gave him a slight nod of understanding. They had seen enough glimpses of that power to suspect there might be far more terrifying things. Ned tapped the table, shifting to ease the pain in his thigh. We can't hide behind ignorance. We only have one choice: to stand ready. We hold Castle Black as the central stronghold. We post watchmen at Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, keep them prepared for a flanking assault, and do what we can to block the old paths. Meanwhile, we pray that the ravens we sent bring real help before the worst of it hits. Mormont glanced at Ned. We've had word that Robb Stark and your bannermen are on the march. If he can drive up the King's Road, we might have a few thousand Northmen within a fortnight. The question is whether that's time enough. John's heart lifted slightly at the thought of Robb leading a northern host. But a fortnight was a long time in this dreadful cold. A host might be slowed by weather, logistical issues, or the endless squabbling that happened between even loyal bannermen. And that was assuming no southern lords interfered, or that the king himself didn't delay. Still, the presence of Robert Baratheon in the field brought some hope. If the king truly marched with his royal armies, the White Walkers would face more than a token force of the Watch. Corin's voice carried a quiet warning. We should assume we're alone for now. That's how the Watch has survived for centuries, by relying on itself. Let us prepare as if no one is coming. No one contradicted him. The men of the Watch had learned over time that their pleas for aid often fell on deaf ears. This new threat was unprecedented, but the uncertainty remained. They concluded the meeting with final orders. Archers to the ramparts, every man trained in dragonglass, oil caches placed along the wall to pour down on whites should they mass at the gates. John escorted Ned carefully down the steps. Every rung of the ladder was slick with ice, and Ned's limp made the descent precarious. At the bottom, they paused to let Ned catch his breath. Ghost pressed his nose against Ned's hand in a gesture of comfort. I should be out there with the men, not hobbling around like an invalid, Ned muttered, frustration coloring his tone. John frowned. You've done plenty already, father. You faced the White Walkers beyond the wall, and you nearly died from that wound. Even a Stark must heal. Ned blew out a frosty breath. Time is a luxury we might not have. He laid a hand on John's shoulder. But you're right. My mind must serve where my body falters. I'll do what I can, write more letters, plan. Just keep me informed of everything. John nodded solemnly. Even that small gesture of paternal trust meant the world to him. They parted ways in the courtyard, Ned heading to the maester's turret to check on any new ravens or letters, John back to the archery yard to oversee the training. The cold daylight was fading. Soon, the White Walkers might move under cover of darkness. John was grimly certain that night would bring nightmares. Sure enough, within hours, Castle Black was roused by the call of horns. One blast, then two, then three. 3 blasts had not been sounded in living memory, at least not for anything but legend. It meant White Walkers. Men scrambled, some half-dressed, hauling themselves to the top of the wall with weapons clutched in numb fingers. Torches burned, their flames guttering in the fierce wind. The swirling darkness beyond the wall seemed alive. John reached the ramparts, heart hammering, and scanned the horizon. Snow fell in sheets, but a faint glow, blue and cold, revealed movement at the very limit of sight. Beneath the howling wind, A noise like whispering ice drifted up. Figures shambled or glided across the open ground. Whites by the dozens, maybe hundreds, a slow, relentless wave of death. Their eyes were filmed, some with a faint ghostly shimmer. Occasionally, a tattered limb or an exposed rib jutted from rotted flesh. Many wore what remained of wildling garb, furs, leathers, now caked with grime. Interspersed among them, gliding with terrifying grace, were at least 2 White Walkers. Their bodies looked impossibly pale, translucent in the torchlight, clad in armor that seemed grown from ice itself. And they were coming straight for the section of the wall beneath Castle Black. Alarmed voices echoed as men rushed to position. Corrin barked orders from a high vantage point. Archers notched dragonglass-tipped arrows. Barrels of oil were pried open, ready to be poured at the first sign of a direct assault. Lord Commander Mormont, though old, hauled himself up to the ramparts, spyglass in hand, cursing the fate that had brought him to command in the midst of an otherworldly war. Jon spotted Ned, leaning heavily on a cane, standing near one of the lower catapult stations. The Lord of Winterfell braced himself, scanning the approaching horde with grim calm. Even from a distance, Jon could see the tension in his father's posture. Here it was, the danger they had long feared, yet so soon. Where were the armies promised? Where was the time to prepare? The wave drew closer. The first Whites reached the base of the wall, stumbling awkwardly on the rocky ground. Some battered uselessly at the ancient ice with lifeless hands. Others collapsed, limbs snapping from the cold, only to twitch and crawl onward. Up on the ramparts, a watch officer shouted the command. Arrows rained down, each tip glinting black in the torchlight. Dozens of Whites fell, pinned or transfixed by the dragonglass arrowheads. The watchers cheered, but only briefly, for the Whites kept coming, indifferent to losses. Where one fell, others dragged themselves forward. Jon saw a White with half its torso missing still clawing the ice, as if mechanical in its undead purpose. Mormont snarled again. More arrows flew. Jon himself fitted one to his bow, took a steadying breath, and let it fly. He watched the arrow strike a tall, thin White through the chest. The thing collapsed unmoving. Dragonglass worked. But as the wave thickened, a new threat emerged, far off to the side, pale riders. White Walkers astride dead horses, the beast's flesh peeled back to reveal patches of bone. They moved unnervingly fast, circling, studying. One raised a spear of ice as if pointing it at the Watch's defenders. Below, Ned Stark leaned on the cane while a Stark guard, Tomard, stood protectively beside him. Ned shouted to the men manning the catapult. "Light it! Fire!" They ignited clay pots of oil-soaked pitch, launched them over the ramparts. The pots crashed among the Whites in bursts of flame. The night lit up in patches as the fire spread quickly across the oil-slick ground. The Whites in the flames flailed wildly, their unnatural moans echoing. Many collapsed into charred husks. The Watchers gained a moment's respite. But White Walkers hated flame no less than dragonglass. One hissed from afar, raising an arm in a gesture Ned did not recognize. An eerie wind seemed to swirl around the base of the wall, snuffing out sections of the flames. The Watchers on the ramparts exchanged alarmed glances. Some kind of sorcery was at work. Parts of the fire died abruptly, leaving only smoke and scorched earth. More Whites surged forth, trudging over the remains of their burned kin. The archers fired arrow after arrow. Jon's arms ached from the repeated pull of the bowstring. The tension in his shoulders felt like molten steel. Yet still the wave approached. He glanced across the rampart to see Sam Tarly, trembling but determined, loosing an arrow that actually struck true, bringing down a White. Sam stared wide-eyed, as if disbelieving that he'd succeeded. Jon afforded him a tight grin of encouragement. Then he returned his attention to the nightmarish scene below. Suddenly, horns sounded again. One blast, then a flurry that signaled something else entirely. Movement behind the wall. Jon whirled, heart lurching, expecting to see a second army somehow circumventing their defenses. But as the men on the walkway peered back, they saw not an army of the dead, but a column of riders with torches streaming in through the main gate below. At their head, a banner rippled, gray and white, the dire wolf of Stark, and among them flew the banner of the crown, a stag on a field of gold. The Watchers gasped. Reinforcements had arrived, but from the south, right when they were needed most. Ned peered down and felt his chest tighten with emotion. There, riding at the forefront, was Robb Stark, armor shining in the torchlight, face set in a determined glare that made him look older than his years. Beside Robb was King Robert Baratheon himself, broader and thicker than Ned remembered, wearing a fur-trimmed cloak that did little to hide his formidable girth. But the king's eyes were aflame with the thrill of battle. Behind them trailed lines of Northmen and crown forces, armored knights, pikemen, archers. Not the full might of the realm, perhaps, but enough to bolster Castle Black's defenses significantly. A renewed roar of horns and shouts erupted from the courtyard as these new forces dismounted. Ned hurried as best he could, cane thumping, to the lift that would carry him down. Jon, seeing his father make the move, signaled the archers to maintain their volleys, then rushed after him. In the courtyard, men parted for Ned. Robb swung down from his horse, cheeks flushed from the cold, and raced to his father's side. Ned let his cane drop and embraced his son, ignoring the dull throb in his thigh. "You're here," he murmured, voice trembling slightly with relief. Robb's grin was fierce. "We rode hard, father. When we heard the horns, we feared the worst." He pulled back, looking Ned over with concern. "You're wounded." "Nothing that won't heal," Ned replied. "You've done well, my boy." Close behind Robb came Robert Baratheon, stepping heavily from his warhorse. Even in the subdued torchlight, his presence loomed large. Broad shoulders, thick neck, a full black beard streaked with gray. His breath steamed in the cold, and he clapped a hand to Ned's shoulder with a force that nearly made Ned wince. "For the love of the seven, Ned," Robert growled, "you picked the damnedest places to have a war. Atop this damned ice wall in the darkest corner of the realm. You had better have some ale for me after this." But there was genuine warmth in his eyes as he studied his old friend, noticing the limp. "I came as quick as I could. Word reached me of walking corpses and monsters of ice. I'd have called it madness if it came from anyone else." Ned dipped his head. "I'm in your debt, Robert. Truly." He stepped aside so the king could see how dire the situation was. "The enemy is just outside. Whites, White Walkers, they're real. It's worse than we feared." Robert's gaze flicked to the top of the wall where silhouettes of men fired arrow after arrow into the darkness. Flames still crackled in patches beyond the ice. "Show me," he said, voice low and grim. He turned to his retinue, dozens of knights, lords, and personal guards, among them the likes of Ser Barristan Selmy, an older but still formidable knight who had insisted on coming to fight for the realm. The king's men brandished steel that shone even in the dim light. "More supplies," Ned prayed, "including food, oil, and pitch for the catapults." "We ride to the top," Robert declared. "Selmy with me. Lord Stark, you too. We'll see these demons ourselves." Ned, aided by Robb, led the king and a small group to the great winch elevator. They ascended slowly, the winch groaning under the weight. The wind whipped at them as they rose, stinging exposed skin. When they reached the rampart, the king stared out at the teeming darkness below. Torches illuminated the crawling, writhing mass of whites. Some catapults continued to lob flaming projectiles. Shrieks echoed. Robert's face hardened. "Gods be good," he breathed. "If someone told me this tale in a wine sink, I'd have drowned them for lying." Ned beckoned to a ranger who offered Robert the Myrish spyglass. The king took it and peered down. After a moment, he stiffened. "That pale shape. Is that—" "A White Walker," Ned said. "We've killed some. They're vulnerable to Valyrian steel and dragonglass, but they're fast, cunning. And they bring the dead with them." Robert lowered the glass. "Then let us send them back to the grave." He stepped forward, bellowing an order for his knights to bring up crossbows, scorpions, anything that could help. They had come equipped for the rumored threat, though they had expected to fight wildlings, not an army of whites. The king's knights began flooding onto the ramparts, displacing some of the Night's Watch archers. They set up heavier crossbows on tripods, testing arcs. Others joined in, forming lines. Ned watched with a surge of relief. For the first time in days, it seemed possible they could hold the wall. Robb, standing beside Jon, looked out at the ghastly sight. He had heard rumors, but seeing it was different. "It's like a nightmare," Robb murmured to his half-brother. Jon nodded, recalling the fights beyond the wall, the cold, the dread in each breath. Ghost bristled at Robb's side as if sensing the unnatural presence. The defenders renewed their assault. Flaming arrows streaked through the sky, fired by the Northmen's expert archers. Some of Robert's knights launched heavy bolts that struck whites with enough force to split them in half. The ground below became a battlefield of scattered corpses, burned flesh, twitching limbs. Another pot of burning pitch was hurled, blossoming into a wave of flame. Cheers went up on the rampart when it engulfed a cluster of whites near a White Walker. The walker sidestepped, gliding back into the shadows. It did not fall, but it did not advance either. In the confusion of battle, no one realized that a smaller group of whites, guided by a single white walker, had maneuvered to the eastern side of Castle Black's perimeter. They reached an old sally port seldom used by the watch. Its wooden door, half-rotten, had not been adequately reinforced. Under the barrage outside, everyone was focused on the direct assault. The whites began pounding at the door, skeletal fists thudding in unison, a hideous rhythm that grew more urgent by the moment. Within minutes, the wood started to splinter. One guard, a young recruit named Pell, was stationed nearby, but he was half frozen and terrified. At the first sign of movement, he sounded an alarm, voice cracking. Men rushed in from the yard, but by the time they arrived, the timbers gave way and the whites poured through, the white walker behind them like a commander urging on its troops. Panic erupted inside the castle. A second battle flared up, this time among the huts and stables at ground level. The whites, all rotting skin and snapping jaws, lunged at the living, raking with blackened nails. One stable boy screamed as he was dragged backward, flailing helplessly. Brothers of the Watch hacked at the undead with swords or spears, but ordinary steel was of limited use unless they dismembered the whites completely. A few had dragon-glass daggers or arrowheads, but in the melee it was hard to get a clean shot. Ned, up on the ramparts, heard the uproar behind him. He whirled just as one of the Black brothers stumbled into view, shouting that the enemy was inside. Jon locked eyes with Ned, then with Robb. "Go," Ned commanded, face taut. "We can't let them overrun us from inside." Jon and Robb sped off, descending the nearest staircase to the courtyard. Ghost followed, a low growl rising from deep in the direwolf's throat. As they emerged into the yard, chaos greeted them. Flaming torches had been toppled, the dark corners lit only by scattered fires. A cluster of whites lurched near the stables, where the frantic whinnies of terrified horses clashed with the moans of the undead. One white, the stable boy's body pinned beneath it, turned its head at Jon's approach, milky eyes rolling. Robb was faster to act, driving the point of his sword into its ribcage, then yanking free. The white hissed and kept moving until Jon darted in with a dragonglass dagger, stabbing it in the skull. The corpse went limp. Robb's face was pale, adrenaline flaring. "Gods, that thing! It didn't even feel my blade," he muttered, kicking the motionless husk aside. Jon nodded grimly. "You have to hit them with dragonglass or destroy the body." He pointed. "More are coming. Over there." A line of Night's Watch brothers, including Sam Tarly, who somehow found himself in the thick of it, were slowly retreating in the face of half a dozen whites. Sam held a torch in one hand, a dragonglass dagger in the other, trembling so badly he nearly dropped them both. The whites advanced, arms outstretched. One wore the tattered remains of a wildling cloak, an icicle crusting what might have once been a beard. Robb and Jon shouted a rallying cry, surging forward. Their presence, along with the men following them, bolstered the Watch's line. Swords flashed. Jon slammed into a white, toppling it, but had to wrestle free of its snapping jaws. Robb thrust his steel blade into another, forcing it back. Sam jabbed his torch at a white's face, causing it to shriek and stagger. In that moment, one of the brothers buried a dragonglass-tipped spear in its side. The white seized up, eyes rolling back, and collapsed. Jon ended another with a downward plunge of the dagger, panting as he kicked free. Each blow that landed properly was a small victory, but the whites were relentless, seemingly unbothered by fear or pain. On the far side of the yard, a white walker strode among the chaos, silent and eerily controlled. In its hand, it gripped a spear of glittering ice. The swirling snow parted around it in unnatural eddies. A black brother rushed at the walker with a sword raised, only for the walker to parry gracefully. The blade shattered on contact with that impossibly sharp ice. Before the man could flee, the walker stabbed him through the chest. Frost spread across the brother's body as he dropped, eyes wide. Jon saw it happen from across the courtyard and felt a surge of cold fury. He turned to Robb. "Help them hold off the whites. I'll try to stop that thing before it kills anyone else." Without waiting for a response, Jon sprinted toward the walker, Ghost keeping pace at his side. The walker regarded Jon with something almost like curiosity. Then it raised its spear, as if issuing a challenge. Jon had a sword at his hip, common castle-forged steel, and a dragon-glass dagger. He knew from experience that ordinary steel would not suffice. He switched the dagger to his main hand. The White Walker smiled, or did something akin to a smile, revealing teeth like shards of ice. It lunged. Jon barely sidestepped, heart pounding. The walker moved with a predatory grace, each step fluid. Jon feinted low, then slashed upward. The walker twisted aside, the dagger's edge scraping its frigid armor, leaving a faint scratch that glimmered like starlight on a frozen lake. Ghost snarled and leaped at the walker's flank. The walker sidestepped with shocking speed, spinning the spear around. Jon shouted a warning. Too late. Ghost yelped as the ice spear cut a bloody line across his shoulder. The direwolf landed hard, whimpering, but scrambled to his feet, hackles raised. Jon used the distraction to dart in again, jabbing for the walker's torso. This time, the walker parried with a flick of its wrist. The spear's haft collided with Jon's side, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled, but forced himself upright, refusing to yield ground. Across the yard, Robb was locked in battle against two wights, hacking them apart with fierce sword strokes. One wight latched onto his cloak, nearly toppling him, before a watch brother severed its arms. Meanwhile, Sam helped drag an injured man away from the melee, face pale as fresh snow. The courtyard was a maelstrom of shouting, steel, snapping bones, and swirling flakes of ice. Jon's fight with the walker intensified. Blow after blow was exchanged, Jon weaving, ducking, trying to find an opening for his dragonglass dagger. Twice he managed to scratch the walker's armor. Each time, the creature hissed, that hateful, icy light flaring in its eyes. Jon sensed that his foe was toying with him, testing his reflexes. Another slash from the spear nearly opened Jon's throat. He jerked back just in time, feeling the cold pass inches from his skin. Each breath burned in his lungs, raw from the frigid air. Ghost tried once more, lunging for the walker's leg. This time, the walker delivered a vicious kick that knocked the direwolf sideways, sending him skidding. Jon seized the chance to strike while the walker was momentarily off balance. With all his might, he drove the dragonglass dagger for war. Aiming for the walker's midsection. He felt resistance, then the dagger sank in. The walker let out a keening wail that cut through the courtyard like a shard of broken ice. Its spear dropped from its hand. For a heartbeat, Jon thought the creature would dissolve like the others before it. But this one was stronger or older. Instead of crumbling instantly, it clutched Jon's wrist, grip colder than death. A surge of chill shot up Jon's arm, numbing his fingers. He tried to wrench free, but the walker pulled him closer, its eyes blazing in inhuman blue. Jon felt his heartbeat stutter as if his very blood was freezing. The walker opened its mouth as if to hiss some terrible incantation into Jon's face. Suddenly, another blade, Valyrian steel, slashed across the walker's back. The creature's scream escalated into a shriek that resonated off the courtyard walls. Ned Stark stood there, sword in hand, the great blade ice glinting under the torchlight. He had come from behind, limping but determined. That single strike severed the walker's spine. With a final, rattling moan, it began to disintegrate. Jon tore free of the walker's grip, stumbling backward. He watched as the creature's flesh cracked, fracturing into thousands of crystalline shards. Within seconds, it shattered upon the courtyard stones, leaving behind only a trickle of icy residue. Jon stared, chest heaving. His entire right arm throbbed from the unnatural cold. Ned lowered ice, breathing hard. Their eyes met, father and son, battered by forces beyond mortal ken. Then Ned extended a hand and Jon gripped it, pulling himself upright. Ghost hobbled over, whimpering softly from the gash in his shoulder. "We have to seal that sally port," Ned said. "If more come through." He got no chance to finish. An arrow zipped past them and struck a charging wight that was barely 6 paces away. The wight pitched forward, pinned by the dragonglass arrow, then ceased movement. Robb lowered his bow, sweat mixing with the melting snow on his face. "We're sealing it now," he gasped, waving a group of men forward. "But we lost at least a dozen brothers." Ned's face hardened. "Get a barricade in place." "Any more of them inside?" "Scattered," Robb replied. "We're hunting them down." The wights that had broken through were being cut off and destroyed one by one. Soon, a ring of crates and wooden beams was erected against the shattered sally port, sealed with nails and hammered iron. Men piled debris as a makeshift reinforcement, unsure whether that alone would suffice but lacking better materials at the moment. The immediate threat inside the walls receded. But above, on the ramparts, the larger battle still raged. It was as if the enemy had tested multiple approaches. By the time the sky began to lighten with the false dawn, the White Walkers and their white hordes withdrew or were driven back by unrelenting barrages of fire and dragonglass. The Watch and their new allies had held. But the toll was high. Dozens of Black brothers lay dead, along with a handful of Robert's knights and too many of the Stark guards. The stench of burnt flesh permeated the air. Weapons were slick with gore, the ground a churned-up mess of ash, mud, and snow. The eastern walls of Castle Black had been partially compromised, and it would take days of labor to shore them up. And all knew this was just the first test. As dawn spread thin light over the battlefield, Ned Stark found himself in the courtyard, resting on a low barrel, leg throbbing. Robert Baratheon approached, arm in a sling from some injury or another, though he brushed off any mention of it. His beard was singed and his eyes were bloodshot, but he wore the expression of an old soldier who had survived many a campaign. He sank onto a nearby bench, wincing. Neither man spoke for a time, the weight of what they had witnessed rendering words redundant. Finally, Robert exhaled, rubbing his face. "My gods, Ned. You told me and I believed you enough to march north, but seeing it firsthand. I still can't believe my eyes. Those pale devils. And they're dead. This is no ordinary war." Ned nodded. "No, it's not." He stared at his hands, still stiff from the chill that had nearly claimed Jon's life. "It's a war for the living. If we fail here, everything we know will die." Robert's gaze flicked around them, bodies laid in rows, men trying to salvage any scrap of workable gear, the ragged remains of the night's horror. "I've never shied from a fight," he said, "but this is different. You have my word, Ned, I'll muster the entire realm if I must. The South can't ignore this." "Thank you," Ned said quietly. "We'll need every sword, every resource." Robb joined them, having given instructions to gather the dead. His face was lined with fatigue, making him look older than his years. A fresh cut marred his brow, blood dried into his hair. "Father, there's still no sign of some of the wildlings. They may have fled once the fighting started." Ned sighed. "We can't blame them. They've lost more than we have in many cases. But if they scatter, they'll be caught out in the open. This is bigger than any feud between wildlings and kneelers. If we can, we should gather them under our protection." Robert grunted but said nothing. The memory of having once considered wildlings mere savages likely felt like folly now. The threat that overshadowed them rendered all old prejudices trivial. Jon arrived, supporting Samwell Tarly, who looked on the verge of collapse. Sam's cloak was shredded, but he seemed unhurt aside from scrapes and bruises. "Sam saved 2 men by driving off the whites with a torch," Jon said with a flicker of pride. "He's braver than he knows." Sam reddened, but there was no time for modesty. We need to burn the bodies quickly," he stammered. "Any dead we don't burn could rise again." That stark reality pressed on them all. Any man who fell in battle against the others could be turned into a weapon if not cremated swiftly. Robb looked at his father. "I'll see to it," he said, voice resolved. He left, calling men to gather tinder and oil. The stench of funeral pyres would soon mingle with the morning air. It was the only way. Throughout that day, they worked to rebuild the battered sections of the wall's courtyard, patch the gates, dispose of the dead. The king's men and the Night's Watch joined forces in a grim but necessary labor. The gallows humor sometimes rose to the surface. Knights of the South joking that they'd fought in tournaments with less bloodshed. Black brothers retorting that at least jousting lances didn't chase after you when you knocked them down. But beneath every jibe lay a quiet fear. This was only a fraction of what might be coming. Ned convened another war council in the evening with Robert, Robb, Lord Commander Mormont, Corran Halfhand, Ser Barristan Selmy, and other key figures. Maps were spread on the same battered table. The men were stooped, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but they forced themselves to concentrate. Lord Commander Mormont set a heavy pewter cup down, sloshing water. "We can't assume the White Walkers gave us their full strength last night. That was likely a probing attack, or an attempt to test our defenses." Ser Barristan nodded, silver hair catching the lamp's glow. "I've seen battle tactics from every corner of the realm. This felt like a skirmish, not the main engagement. They retreated before dawn, as if unwilling to spend more whites on our walls yet." Robert's lips curled in a bitter smile. "They're not mindless beasts, then. They plan. They test. I'd almost prefer facing a mindless horde. Corrin pointed to the map. They've scattered watchers along the forest's edge. Our scouts say there are more to the west, possibly near the Fist of the First Men, where some older fortifications remain. We should consider sending out a large force to disrupt them before they can mass again. Ned shook his head slightly. That's dangerous. The moment we march out, we risk being flanked or surrounded. We're safe behind the wall, at least for now. But can we afford to wait for the next assault? Robb asked, frowning. They'll come with greater numbers eventually. Robert rubbed his chin. But if we send out a host, we might lose them in the forest. The White Walkers know the terrain better. And in this cursed winter, half of them might freeze to death before even seeing the enemy. Corrin, who had traveled those northern wastes more than any man alive, nodded in agreement. It's a labyrinth of ice and pine out there, riddled with hidden crevasses, ravines, and paths only the free folk know well. Mormont sighed. We hold the wall then, but that can't be our plan forever. He looked at Ned. You've already sent ravens to every great lord in Westeros? Yes, Ned answered. We've had responses from many. Some disbelieve, some promise men. But distance is the problem. Even if the Tullys, Arryns, Tyrells, and Martells unite, it will take weeks, if not months, to assemble a proper host and march them north. The White Walkers might not give us that long. Robert drank from the cup, brow furrowed. I'll send out more ravens under my royal seal, naming this a threat to the entire realm. Anyone who ignores it does so at their peril. Maybe that will stir them. Meanwhile, we steel ourselves for the next attack. So it was decided, remain at Castle Black, fortify the adjacent fortresses if possible, and gather more men as they arrived. The combined might of the North and the Crown might hold the wall if the next wave of the enemy did not come in overwhelming numbers. Over the following days, Ned and Jon patrolled the top of the wall, scanning the horizon. Sometimes they saw faint shapes moving at a distance, whites or White Walkers or simply illusions conjured by swirling snow. Riders from Robert's cavalry scouted short distances beyond the wall's eastern edge near the coastline, but discovered nothing conclusive. More wildlings trickled in, fearful refugees who'd escaped devastation deeper in the haunted forest. Some told stories of entire tribes wiped out, of the dead rising, of White Walkers taking infants. Rumors circulated that the others were amassing a truly vast legion somewhere near the Frostfangs, but no one could confirm the truth. Meanwhile, the dead from the first assault were burned in huge pyres that stained the sky with black smoke. Jon forced himself to watch as the bodies of men he had known, men who had laughed with him in the courtyard, were consumed by flames. Better this than letting them rise again as whites. Still, each funeral pyre weighed on his heart. Ghost walked beside him, healing slowly. The direwolf's fur was scorched in one patch, and the cut on his shoulder left a pink ridge of scar, but his spirit remained unbroken. One gray morning, as Jon assisted Sam in sorting new dragon glass shipments that had arrived with the king's entourage Robert had ordered them brought from Dragonstone, he spotted a raven fluttering down. It landed on a post near them, croaking for attention. Sam gently retrieved the message from its tiny canister. His eyes flicked over the words. It's from Winterfell, Sam said, excitement in his voice. Maester Luwin. He says Lady Stark and the younger Starks are safe. But there's news. Jon felt a pang. He rarely allowed himself to wonder how Lady Catelyn might feel about his presence here with Ned. He suspected she felt only relief to be rid of him. Still, the mention of Winterfell stirred memories of simpler times. Sam read on. They say that more northern bannermen are en route. The Umbers, the Karstarks, the Manderleys. Some are traveling with large supply wagons. Grain, salted fish, maybe even fresh horses. He looked up, hope shining in his eyes. We need those supplies. Jon's chest loosened a fraction. Thank the gods. Let's show this to Lord Stark right away. They carried the letter to Ned, who read it under the flickering torchlight in the corridor. A faint smile crossed his lips. This is a blessing. Food is as crucial as swords right now. We can't starve through a siege. If winter truly falls in full force, every morsel will count. He turned to Sam. Send a reply to Maester Luwin, thanking him and asking for more details. We need to coordinate where these supplies will be stored. Sam nodded eagerly and hurried off to compose the message. As he vanished, Ned rested a hand on Jon's shoulder. You see, son? We're not alone. The North stands with us. We must hold faith. Jon nodded, swallowing the knot of emotion that formed at the simple word son. We will, father, he said, his voice quiet. That afternoon, amid the hustle of reinforcing the gates, an unexpected visitor arrived at Castle Black, Tormund Giantsbane, a prominent wildling leader, and a small retinue of his folk. He approached under a makeshift flag of truce, calling out that he wished to speak with Eddard Stark or the Lord Commander. The watchers on the wall exchanged nervous glances, uncertain if this was a trick. But eventually, Tormund and his party were allowed through the main gate under heavy guard. He was a big man, thickly muscled, with a bushy red beard and an air of infectious confidence about him. As soon as he entered the yard, Tormund roared for wine and food, proclaiming that he'd had enough of White Walkers to last a lifetime. Lord Commander Mormont greeted him warily, Ned standing close by, along with Jon, Robb, and Robert Baratheon. The king eyed Tormund with the sort of half-amusement, half-curiosity one might show a circus attraction. Tormund bowed with exaggerated flourish. Tormund Giantsbane, tall talker, hornblower, breaker of ice, and father of hosts. Come to treat with the crows and kneelers. His eyes flicked to Robert, sizing up the big southern king. You must be the one they call King Robert. By the gods, you're nearly as big as me. Robert barked out a laugh, unoffended. Is that so? You've arrived at a dire time, wildling. Why should I not lock you in chains? Tormund shrugged, unperturbed. You could try, but then you'd have no chance of hearing the juicy secrets I've brought. Word is you lot want to kill the others. Same as us. The free folk are scattered, but we're not fools. We see the real threat. The White Walkers took my neighbors, my cousins, burned my home. We want them gone as much as you do. Ned studied Tormund's face. The man's brashness was clear, but so was a certain honesty. Go on, Ned said quietly. What secrets do you have? Tormund spread his arms. I've traveled near the Frostfangs, near Harhome, even a ways beyond. The White Walkers are building their strength in the old valleys. Thousands of dead roam under their command. Aye, thousands. He let that figure hang in the air. Even Robert glanced sharply at him. They gather to make a push that'll drown this wall in corpses. Won't matter how tall your ice block is if they come in force. It'll be like an avalanche of dead. The men around Tormund shifted uneasily. Robb's expression grew taut. Jon recalled the sight of just a few hundred whites at most, now Tormund spoke of thousands. The possibility was stomach-churning. Robert's voice rumbled with controlled anger. You come with fearsome words, wildling. Is that all you bring? A grin tugged at Tormund's mouth. I bring knowledge and a proposition. Let my people south of the wall. We'll help you defend it. The free folk don't want to become whites any more than you do. We've families, children. We'll fight for life. All we ask is freedom, no kneeling, no heads on spikes. Mormont scowled. The Watch has never permitted thousands of wildlings to cross. Our vows. Bugger your vows, Tormund interrupted with surprising boldness. Your precious realm is about to be overrun. You want more warriors or not? We might not be knights, but we can swing an axe and shoot a bow. Good luck holding off an army of dead without help from those who know the north beyond the wall. Ned and Robert exchanged glances. It was a risky offer, but also a potential boon. The wildlings knew the terrain, might provide valuable intelligence, or fight with ferocity. And if Tormund was telling the truth about the White Walkers' numbers, every possible ally was needed. The tension in the courtyard was palpable. A ring of black brothers stood around, uncertain. Robert exhaled loudly. Gods damn it, Ned. Never thought I'd be fighting side by side with wildlings. But these are strange times. If we say no, we risk them aligning with the White Walkers out of desperation. Tormund bristled. We'd never align with those monsters. We'd rather die first. Ned spoke carefully, measuring each word. If we allow you and your people through, you must abide by our laws. The North is not lawless. There will be no raiding, no pillaging. Tormund spread his hands. We just want to live. Raid the others, sure, but not your villages if you treat us fairly. Robert rubbed his temples. Fine. But cross me, Tormund, and I'll have your head. I can promise you that. His tone held a lethal edge. Tormund laughed, a big booming sound. Fair enough, King. I've heard you're a man of your word. If you kill me, I suppose I'll be too dead to argue. He then knelt, not in a posture of fealty but to rummage in his pack, retrieving a small roll of tanned hide. Here's a map, if you want to call it that. We scrawled some marks showing where we last saw the White Walkers in force. Might help you plan. Corrin snatched it up, scanning the rough lines. He recognized certain landmarks, though the map was crude. Frostfang foothills. Harhome, the Valley of Then. They're converging. If these marks are accurate, we could be dealing with an army that dwarfs anything we've faced. Ned suppressed a shudder. The decision was made to accept Tormund's proposal. They would have to handle the influx of wildling refugees carefully, scanning for infiltrators or troublemakers, but if it meant more allies against the White Walkers, so be it. Mormont grudgingly agreed to open the wall's gates under heavy supervision to let them trickle in. Robert seconded the plan, though his face betrayed deep misgivings. So began an uneasy alliance. Over the next week, columns of ragged wildlings arrived at Castle Black, many malnourished or injured, wearing furs and hides caked in frost. They carried meager possessions, herding half-starved goats or dragging makeshift sleds. The sight stirred sympathy in some of the watch. These were families, children clinging to mothers, old men coughing in the cold. Others felt revulsion or distrust, remembering centuries of wildling raids. Robert's knights watched them with suspicion, hands never far from their sword hilts. Yet Tormund and his more outspoken fellows made a point of greeting the Black brothers with jokes, stories, and practical help, slowly lessening the tension. Ned supervised the process, ensuring there was order. Tents pitched outside Castle Black, guarded by both watch and wildling volunteers. Food rations were carefully distributed. There were scuffles, but no major violence. During one patrol of the makeshift wildling camp, Ned found himself approached by a tall, gaunt figure with a shaved head and worn leathers. The man introduced himself as Rattleshirt, though others whispered he was called the Lord of Bones for his habit of wearing trophies from fallen foes. His manner was abrasive, but he seemed grudgingly cooperative. Ned handled him with the same steady calm he used on quarrelsome bannermen, treating him with courtesy while making it clear that any trouble would be met with swift discipline. And always overshadowing every small moment of progress lay the knowledge that the next White Walker assault might be unstoppable. Scouts returned daily with ominous tales, sightings of more whites, enclaves of the dead prowling abandoned villages, even fresh footprints near the mountains. One rider came back half-dead from exposure, claiming he saw a giant walking among the whites, pale and rotting, swung like a puppet by a White Walker's will. Though unverified, the story spread through the camp, deepening the fear. At last, word arrived that the remaining great northern houses were close: House Umber's forces, House Karstark's, House Manderly's, and lesser bannermen. Some were only a day behind. Along with them marched more knights of the crown, as well as an envoy from House Tyrell, ironically led by Ser Loras Tyrell himself. The Tyrell scion had evidently convinced his family of the seriousness of the threat, or perhaps they simply wanted to earn royal favor. Regardless, additional swords were coming. Morale lifted as if the watchers on the wall sensed a shifting tide. Ned took no chances, though. He organized training for any wildlings who wished to learn how to fight with dragonglass weapons, ensuring the newly arrived ones understood the White Walker's vulnerabilities. Jon and Robb oversaw these sessions. Ghost prowled at Jon's side, still healing but forever watchful. Robb taught the wildlings basic formation tactics, something many of them found unnecessary or distasteful, but Tormund cheerfully told them to stop complaining and listen. "The crows have done this for centuries," he boomed. "Might be something to learn before the others eat your bones." Each training session was tinged with urgency. They had no illusions that the White Walkers would remain idle forever. One crisp dawn, the lookouts spotted dust clouds in the south, signs that the northern bannermen were arriving. A hush fell over Castle Black as they beheld the approach of thousands of marching men, banners fluttering. The roaring bear of Mormont from Bear Island, distinct from the Lord Commander's family, the sunburst of Karstark, the merman of Manderly, the giant of Umber, and countless minor sigils. At the center, a large supply train rumbled forward, wagons loaded with barrels, crates, sacks. The watchers on the ramparts let out cheers. Even the king's knights who had never traveled this far north seemed impressed. Ned, alongside Robert and Lord Commander Mormont, stood at the main gate to greet them. Leading the column was Great Jon Umber, a massive man with a booming laugh and a beard that seemed to rival Tormund's. He dismounted heavily, giving Ned a broad grin. "Stark, I see you've been making friends." He nodded toward the wildlings, who stared back warily. Ned clasped the Grachan's forearm. "We have. We'll need every ally in this war." A thick-set man with graying hair pushed forward, wearing Karstark colors. "Lord Eddard," he said, voice solemn. "We came as soon as word reached us. My father. He was lost last winter to a wildling raid, but I see now the real threat is out there." He jerked his head toward the wall's northern side. "Tell me how my men can help." Ned thanked him and introduced him to the king. Robert handled the formalities well enough, though he quickly tired of them and roared for someone to bring ale. The men busied themselves unloading supply wagons, setting up additional tents, and reinforcing the existing fortifications. More blacksmiths set to work forging arrowheads from dragonglass lumps. The entire area around Castle Black blossomed into a sprawling encampment, with banners fluttering in the frigid wind. Even so, the tension never let up. Every man knew they stood at the brink of an apocalyptic battle. Later that evening, with 1,000 fires burning in the yard and beyond, the combined forces of the North, the Crown, the Night's Watch, and the wildlings settled into a nervous vigil. Men swapped ghost stories, sharpened weapons, or prayed. Some wrote last letters to loved ones far away. In the command tent, a large pavilion erected near the gates, Ned, Robert, and the various lords and commanders gathered once more around maps. Torches ringed the tent, casting flickering shadows on anxious faces. Ned tapped the central portion of the map. "We hold Castle Black at the center. The King's men and the Tyrell Knights fortify the approach. The Northmen will spread along the eastern and western flanks to guard against infiltration. The wildlings and rangers can operate in the forest, scouting and harassing any undead that try to circumvent the wall." He looked up, catching Tormund's eye. "You'll be our eyes out there." Tormund nodded, arms folded across his broad chest. "If we see the whites, we'll give a horn blast. 2 blasts if we spot White Walkers. 3 if it's a big force." Robert picked at his beard, scanning the map. "And if they come in the tens of thousands? We can't fight them all on open ground. Even with these new numbers, we're still at a disadvantage." Ned's voice was steady. "The wall remains our best defense. If they throw themselves at it, we have superior elevation, the scorpions, the dragonglass arrows. Our greatest weakness is if they find a way around, or if they scale it with some foul magic. Or if they concentrate on a weak castle along the wall and break through there." The Great John smacked a fist into his palm. "Then we'll have outriders patrolling the length of the wall. No White Walker sets foot in our lands without a fight." Ser Barristan nodded. "We must respond swiftly to any breach. That means riders ready to move at a moment's notice. We can station them at intervals along the foot of the wall." Robert, uncharacteristically serious, glanced at each face. "Then that's our plan. We dig in, defend, and pray these devils break upon our defenses." He paused, then added quietly, "And if they break through, we make them pay in blood for every inch. That's all we can do." They agreed, each man preparing to lead his portion of the force. The meeting ended with a grim sense of unity. Outside, the wind howled, a chorus of whispers in the dark. Beyond the flickering campfires lay the endless black night of the far north. Somewhere out there, an army of the dead waited. Days passed without a major assault, but the tension only grew. Reports trickled in from scouts, fresh white sightings, footprints in the snow, even glimpses of White Walkers in the distance. A creeping sense of dread settled over the encampment. Sleep became fitful, men waking to the slightest sound. The whinny of a horse could send a tremor through entire tents. On the 7th day after the northern bannermen arrived, the horns sounded again, 3 blasts at dawn, echoing across the snowy wastes. John, who had been dozing in his gear, jolted awake, heart pounding. 3 blasts meant White Walkers in force. He dashed outside to see men scrambling, pulling on helms, snatching weapons. Ghost bounded at his side, hackles raised. The sky was a dull gray, thick with clouds that promised more snow. A biting wind whipped the banners. From the top of the wall came urgent shouts. John sprinted to the courtyard, nearly colliding with Robb, who was strapping on his sword belt. "They're coming," Robb rasped. "Scouts say they're massing, maybe thousands." Ned emerged from the king's tower, leaning on his cane. His face was set in grim resolve. Behind him strode Robert, pulling on gauntlets, flanked by a retinue of armored knights. Tormund was there too, Redbeard bristling, shouting instructions to wildling scouts. The horns kept up their call, each note reverberating like a dirge. In moments, the courtyards and ramparts thrummed with activity. Thousands of men formed ranks, archers at the ready, scorpions and ballistae cranked into position, barrels of flaming pitch arrayed. The watchers on the wall peered into the distant gloom, where an unholy glow began to flicker. It was as though a spectral aurora manifested near the horizon, pale and malevolent. The White Walkers were no longer content to bide their time. John pushed through the crowd to the top of the wall, Ghost at his heels. The climb was harrowing, but adrenaline numbed his fear. When he reached the parapet, the sight before him stole his breath. He'd seen smaller gatherings of undead before, but nothing like this. The land to the north was crowded with shadows, an unfathomable number of whites, a slow-moving sea of pallid flesh. Interspersed among them, that cold, bluish light glimmered around the tall figures of White Walkers, dozens or more. From the vantage of the wall, it looked like an unstoppable tide. Ned, leaning heavily on the ice-crusted rampart, drew in a sharp breath. "So it begins," he whispered. Robb stood on Ned's other side, eyes wide. Even Robert Baratheon, usually so boisterous, said nothing. His face was set in stony determination. Qhorin and Mormont exchanged grim looks. A low, unnatural keening sound rose from the mass of undead, a discordant chorus that set men's teeth on edge. The whites shambled forward, rank on rank, some clad in remnants of armor, others in rags. Here and there, a giant shape lumbered reanimated giants with pale eyes and flaking flesh. The Watchers realized Tormund's men had not been exaggerating. The others had discovered how to raise giant corpses, and now they strode among the whites like living siege engines. From the southern side of the wall, horns and war drums answered, men shouting to bolster courage. The scorpions and catapults pivoted, their crews aligning them with practiced speed. Archers stood in neat rows, dragonglass arrows nocked. Others prepared to pour barrels of flaming oil when the enemy drew near enough. A hush fell, the hush of thousands of hearts pounding in unison. Then the enemy advanced at a slow, steady crawl, as if some malignant intelligence orchestrated their every step. The White Walkers in the rear glided across the ice, impassive and terrifying. The Watchers forced themselves to remain calm, to hold until the whites entered range. Jon felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the biting cold. His stomach churned with both fear and anticipation. When the front rank of whites reached a patch of ground spiked with caltrops and stakes, hastily prepared defenses, they staggered, some impaling themselves. But more came on, climbing over the fallen. The first wave approached arrow range. A stern-faced officer raised a horn to his lips and sounded the command. Arrows flew, thousands in a single volley, forming a dark arc through the sky. They plunged among the whites, and many collapsed, skewered by dragonglass or set aflame by ale-soaked tips. Men on the wall cheered. But the mass of undead was so vast that the fallen barely made a dent. Undeterred, the horde moved on. At the king's urging, catapults launched clay pots of burning pitch. Fire blossomed among the ranks of whites. The stench of burning flesh wafted upward. Yet the wave did not slow. The giants roared, swinging massive clubs improvised from tree trunks. They smashed aside charred whites in their path, mindlessly forging onward. One was struck by a scorpion bolt aimed at its skull, splattering black blood as it toppled, taking a half-dozen whites with it. Still they came. The Watchers unleashed volley after volley, reloading as fast as numb fingers allowed. Jon loosed arrow after arrow, each finding a white's chest or head. He tried not to notice how the parted flesh revealed bone and icy rot. Ghosts prowled restlessly, hackles raised. Men shouted encouragement to one another. Tormund's wildlings perched near the eastern portion of the wall, adding their own arrows to the barrage. Qhorin and the rangers stood ready to repel any attempt to climb. Even Sam, face streaked with soot, handled a smaller bow, valiantly firing at the onrushing tide. Then the White Walkers themselves joined the fray. They stepped forward, raising arms or weapons of ice, and an unnatural wind stirred the battlefield. The nearest flames guttered, as if starved of air. Some simply winked out, leaving the ground dark once more. A wave of cold seemed to sweep across the front lines, and whites that had been too damaged to move suddenly jerked upright again, reanimated a second time. Gasps of horror rippled across the defenders. Even Robert's knights, hardened by tourneys and campaigns, stared aghast at the scene below. Ned Stark's voice rang out, projecting calm authority. "Keep firing. Stop them at all costs. Send word to the flanks. Do not let them breach the sides." Messengers sprinted along the wall to deliver commands. Drums pounded, horns blared. The defenders renewed their effort, launching more flaming pots, more arrows. The clash escalated into a crescendo of violence. The ground quaked as the giants battered at the wall's base, though they could not truly damage the immense structure of ice without specialized siege engines. Some whites tried to scale the wall, claws scrabbling at the slick surface. But the steep ice repelled them, and men above poured boiling oil or rained arrows upon the climbers. Yet in the swirling chaos, pockets of undead managed to find gullies or hidden crevasses that offered partial ascents. The Watchers had to remain vigilant, dispatching archers to every vantage point. For hours the battle raged, a grim stalemate. The defenders poured destruction upon the undead horde, while the White Walker's dark sorcery kept the whites moving. The day wore on, cold and miserable. Exhaustion gnawed at the men on the ramparts. Lips split in the cold. Fingertips bled from repeated bowstrings. Yet they dared not falter. If they let up, even for a moment, the tide of undead would swell forward. Late in the afternoon, a new terror emerged. One of the White Walkers at the rear raised a horn of gleaming ice to its lips. The note it blew sent a shiver through every living being. It resonated across the battlefield, deeper and more piercing than any mortal horn. And with that sound, massive shapes came lumbering from behind the main horde. Undead mammoths, their hides patchy, tusks chipped, eyes blazing with pale fire. A handful of white giants rode these beasts, brandishing clubs. A half-dozen living giants, Tormund's kin, who had joined the wildlings, roared in anger from behind the lines. But they could do little at such a distance. Even from atop the wall, the defenders felt the ground shake as the undead mammoths approached. Each step was thunder. The beasts slammed into the spikes and barricades at the base of the wall with unstoppable force. Wood splintered, stakes shattered, men cursed. Crews rushed to aim scorpions at the lumbering monstrosities, but the white giants on their backs hurled huge boulders that smashed some of the siege engines. Stone and ice shards rained down, sending archers tumbling. Focus fire on the mammoths. Came the shout from countless throats. Bolts streaked downward. One mammoth bellowed, a savage, earth-shaking sound as a dragoglass bolt embedded in its neck. It staggered, toppling sideways. The giant on its back tumbled free and was immediately pelted with flaming arrows until it lay still. But the other mammoths kept coming, flailing tusks like battering rams. Ghost snarled, ears pinned. Jon could hardly steady his bow. Next to him, Robb clenched his jaw, launching arrow after arrow with deadly aim. He struck one undead mammoth in the eye, but it only shrieked and kept charging. More catapults launched flaming clay pots, scoring direct hits. Fires burst across the mammoth's rotting fur. Some collapsed in a thrashing inferno, but others reached the wall's base with enough momentum to slam into it, rocking the defenders above. One battered section near an old guard tower cracked under the impact, sending chunks of ice plummeting. Men scrambled to reinforce it. As twilight fell, the battlefield became a swirl of shadows and flickering fires. The Watchers lit every torch, every brazier, every pitch-soaked brand they had. The glow was meager against the vast darkness. The whites glimmered in and out of view. White Walkers glided like phantoms, unbowed by the carnage. In the sky, the first stars appeared, cold and unblinking, like a million watching eyes. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of ceaseless slaughter, the undead host began to pull back. A hollow victory for the night, perhaps, but no one dared celebrate. The White Walkers' retreat was measured as though they were content with testing the defenders, leaving behind thousands of white corpses that might yet be resurrected. The men on the ramparts shouted for final volleys, sending arrows and burning pots onto the retreating ranks. But soon the darkness swallowed them, their pale glow vanishing among the trees. Drenched in sweat and blood, the defenders stood, hearts hammering. Another day won, but at what cost? The base of the wall was littered with twisted bodies of men and whites alike. The ring of barricades lay in ruins. Dozens of scorpions and catapults had been smashed. Hundreds of the living had perished, and many more nursed wounds that might fester in the biting cold. As the battered Watchers doused fires and tended the wounded, Ned Stark exchanged a long look with Robert Baratheon. No words were needed. This was merely a prelude to a larger catastrophe. If the White Walkers could muster an army of that size and still hold back some portion in reserve, the next attack would be even worse. Ned's leg screamed in pain, but he forced himself to descend the wall, leaning on Jon and Robb. At the foot, they found a scene of devastation. Corpses were everywhere. The stench of death mingled with smoke. Groans of the injured filled the air. Sam Tarly rushed past, directing men with torches to burn every white corpse. Burn them, he shouted, voice shaking. Lord Commander Mormont, face streaked with soot, was helping to carry the fallen to hastily arranged pyres. Tormund trotted up, limping slightly, his beard singed. We killed a bunch of 'em, Tormund panted. But they'll be back. More than this, likely. Ned nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. We'll be ready. We have to be. In the flickering torchlight, Robert pressed a hand to Ned's shoulder. We'll make our stand here, Ned, no matter what. Even if half the realm fails to come, they'll break upon this wall. Ned looked at the men around him, exhausted, wounded, but unbroken in spirit. He thought of Catelyn, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon, safe, he prayed, in Winterfell, of all the children and families throughout Westeros who had no true grasp of the nightmare forming beyond the wall. "We stand," he echoed softly, voice quiet yet firm, "for them, for the living." And so, under the dying light of day, the defenders of humanity stood together amidst the snow and the ashes, bracing for a dawn that promised no respite. Winter had come in full force, and beyond the wall lurked an enemy as relentless as death itself. Yet men of all stripes, lords, commoners, wildlings, and crows, had united beneath the dire wolf and the stag. Their resolve burned bright, a single flame against the encroaching cold. The next sunrise would find them bloodied but unbowed, determined to defend the realms of men until their final breath. They had no illusions of an easy victory, but in each other's eyes, they saw courage enough to endure, and perhaps, just perhaps, to triumph over the longest night.